All right, in this chapter, we're going to take a look at public opinion on the death penalty. So the death penalty evokes an emotional response, and it tends to be a divisive issue. In Trop v. Dulles in 1958, there was a case dealing with the revocation of citizenship, and this is where we get this standard called evolving standards of decency. And they said judges must consider what people deem decent while recognizing that societal standards change as society evolves. And Justice Cardozo in 1921 remarked there's a human element to judicial decision making. Now, capital punishment exists largely because it's supported by the American public. Social solidarity, as we've talked about before, refers to the degree of cohesiveness in society. Common ground shared by individuals binds them together in our social institutions. The death penalty is arguably a mechanism of social solidarity when it is perceived as justly administered. In 1972, Justice Stewart said that he feared that without a mechanism of ridding society of perceived evil, like the death penalty, the emergence of anarchy and vigilante justice would be an inevitable consequence. So, how does public support maintain the death penalty? Support for capital punishment often demonstrates a politician's willingness to, quote, get tough. Prosecutors and judges might also feel public pressure to seek or sentence someone to death to retain their elected position. Now, California Supreme Court Chief Justices Byrd, Reynoso, and Grodin were all not retained in a retention election due to their positions on the death penalty. Governors are also key players. They may refuse to veto anti-death penalty legislation and be less willing to support clemency. In 2003, Governor Ryan of Illinois commuted the sentences of all 167 death row inmates in Illinois. Now, it's important to note that he did this 2 days before leaving office. So, evolving standards of decency attempts to infer what the framers of the Constitution might consider to be a proper standard for modern America, a measure of what the people want. So SCOTUS is at a minimum indirectly influenced by public opinion. They're nominated by an elected president and confirmed by an elected Senate. Every president in recent history has nominated at least one Supreme Court justice, and they can often try to tip the balance in their party's favor. Now, there's two theories used to explain judicial decision-making amongst Supreme Court justices. One is the attitudinal model, and one is the political adjustment hypothesis. The attitudinal model says decisions are the primary result of their individual ideological attitudes, and those attitudes are fundamental and long-lasting. Now, the political adjustment hypothesis says justices are likely to be strategic when deciding cases strongly linked to public view. They're willing to step outside their individual beliefs to maintain a positive public image. Now, we talked before that jury nullification can be used to oppose the death penalty, and it's a less visible form of opposition. Now, during the Enlightenment period, which is in the mid-18th century of Europe, we began to look away from the rule of church and began looking to science, and there's a strong emphasis on reason. Beccaria in 1764 called for an end to the death penalty, said it was excessive, and that instead we could use banishment to protect the public from these types of offenders. Franklin, Jefferson, and Madison, founding fathers, adopted many of the same ideas. Now, in the first half of the 19th century, we have an anti-gallows movement, and they're beginning to spread the word about the atrocities of executions, and public executions end. The number of capital crimes are reduced, and some states abolish the death penalty. And then you can see here to the right, this is a picture of the gallows. The gallows is where people were hanged. Now, the Gallup poll is the most prominent public opinion poll in the U.S., and they have asked about the death penalty and supported the death penalty since 1936. If you look here at this chart, you can see how support in favor and support against the death penalty, or lack of support for the death penalty, has changed over time, right? And we could see the percentages based on year. Now, 2 months prior to the Furman decision, support was at 50%. 5 months after Furman, support was at 57%. So public support for capital punishment is positively correlated with support for get tough measures. The violent crime rate also seems to be something that helps predict support for the death penalty. Support for the death penalty was highest in 1994 when the violent crime rate was 713.6 per 100,000 people in the population. In 1966, the violent crime rate was 220 per 100,000 people in the population. And here we could see the violent crime rate, both property crime and violent crime, and how that has trended over time. Now, one thing we often see is that when we ask the question differently, instead of just adding yes, death penalty, no death penalty, but instead we throw in life without parole, support for the death penalty decreases. And here we can see those three options starting in 1986 when they began asking the question through 2010. Here we can also see which states have the death penalty and which ones do not have the death penalty. Red states have the death penalty, blue have the death penalty, and purple are states that have the death penalty, but the governor has imposed a moratorium, so that means no death sentences are being carried out. So recall a few chapters ago we talked about the Marshall hypothesis. This comes from Justice Marshall. Even when punishment is not excessive and has legitimate legal purpose, it could still be invalid if public sentiment abhors it. So Marshall is stressing the need for the public to be adequately informed before deciding if they are pro or anti-death penalty, and posited that when Americans are properly informed about the death penalty, quote, the great mass of citizens would conclude that the death penalty is immoral and therefore unconstitutional. Now, if a person's underlying belief in the death penalty is retributive in nature, then proper education will do little to change that. But he did feel that citizens should consider capital punishment in light of all information presently available. But it's difficult to assess this empirically because different studies have operationalized that concept differently. So in 1976, Sarat and Vidmar surveyed 181 subjects from Amherst, and they provided an essay on death penalty topics, which was how they were going to educate them, did find a significant reduction in death penalty support. Vidmar and Dittenhofer did a similar study with 39 undergrads in Canada in 1981, and they also found significant decline in support. One study, however, did find the opposite. Today, when we educate someone, we might also want to include information about death row exonerees. Lambert and Clark did this in 2001 and found it did reduce support for the death penalty. There's been a global trend towards abolishing the death penalty, and since 2003, an average of 2 countries per year have abolished it. As of 2010, 96 countries have abolished it. 5 countries leading in the number of executions are China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and U.S. U.S. is the only developed Western country still using the death penalty. The death penalty has also become a human rights issue. Now, once a country abolishes the death penalty, it's highly unlikely that they will restore it. Italy did abolish it in 1889, reinstated it in 1928, and then abolished it again in 1948. Canada unsuccessfully tried to bring it back in 1987, and 2/3 of the British want to see it reinstated. And that wraps up our chapter on public opinion of the death penalty.